Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Clark, and thank you all for coming here, both those in person and those listening in online. It's an honor to be here to talk a little about the relationship between James K. Polk as president and James Buchanan as Secretary of State. Before I get to the relationship, though, I want to talk a little about James K. Polk as an individual. I suppose here at Wheatland and at Lancaster History, Buchanan is somewhat of a known quantity, but James K. Polk may not be. I like to refer to him as the most important president people have not heard of. Here is a contemporary image of Polk. He was born in 1795 in North Carolina. At the top right here, you can see a recreation of the cabin where he was born and a storage cabin nearby. This was actually a fairly large cabin, so it's not so much a sign of being in the backwoods as being among the local elite, actually. But as he was growing up, his parents were up-and-coming farmers. They owned enslaved African Americans to grow tobacco and other crops for them. And by the time he was 11, they had achieved enough wealth that they were able to move to the far western frontier, that is the area of Nashville, to establish an even larger farming operation. His father helped to found the town of Columbia and the county of Murray, just southwest of Nashville. At the bottom right there, you can see the house where Polk grew up in there, which is somewhat more impressive than the log cabin. There, his father was successful both as a surveyor, buying and selling land in Tennessee, and as a planter, acquiring more enslaved African Americans and growing larger amounts of tobacco and food crops, so that by the time Polk himself, James, became an adult, he was able to somewhat follow in his father's footsteps. He began sort of a dual career. After graduating from the University of North Carolina, he began practicing as a lawyer, read law in the office of a prominent senator and lawyer, Felix Grundy, and also began acquiring land of his own. He obtained a plantation in far western Tennessee, kind of near Memphis, and later sold that and purchased an even larger one in Mississippi, in Yalobusha County. By the end of his life, he owned 56 enslaved people and who were producing a large amount of cotton that enabled him to have quite a wealthy position in life. Meanwhile, he'd entered politics. Around the time that he married, he started running for elective office. The story goes, according to family lore, that when he proposed marriage to Sarah Childress, a woman in the Tennessee elite, she told him that she'd marry him, but only if he ran for office, because at the time he was clerk of the state legislature and that wasn't good enough. The story is told as kind of a joke in a memoir that friends of hers put together near the end of her life. So he did run for the state legislature, won, then moved on to Congress, served a long congressional career in the US House, eventually became Speaker. He remains to this day the only Speaker of the House who became president. After that, in the late 1830s, he was governor of Tennessee. Now, that brings us into the 1840s. And this is where Polk and Buchanan start to have a real relationship. They had some interaction when they were both in Congress, Buchanan in the Senate, Polk in the House, but not really that much. Both of them, however, had become prominent Democrats. They were kind of the second generation of Democratic politicians after Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson, the first generation, had put the party together. Well, in 1844, by this time, Polk is out of political office. He had served his one term as governor, but then had lost his bid for re-election and lost again 2 years later. And now in 1844, he's looking to put himself back into office, trying to restart his political career. And so it comes down to the presidential election that year. Going into it, it was pretty clear to everyone who the nominees would be for president. The two parties were the Whigs and the Democrats. The Whigs were clearly going to nominate Henry Clay, who was a prominent Kentuckian, major planter, and had served many roles in the government, in the Senate, in the House, in cabinet posts. And several times he ran for president under several different parties. He never won. You've never heard of President Clay, but that was indeed the nominee that year. The Democrats, pretty much everyone expected, were going to nominate Martin Van Buren. He had served as president for 4 years, then lost his bid for re-election in 1840, but it was expected now he'll run so that he can return to the White House. And that would have happened except for one big mistake Van Buren made. The big issue in this election was Texas. I'm going to discuss it a little more later, but in sum, Texas was an independent country at the time and wanted to be annexed to the United States. This idea was very popular, especially among Democrats and especially among white people in the US South. They wanted to bring in Texas because, unlike most of Mexico, Texas had a slave-based plantation economy, and plantation owners wanted more land to spread US slave-based economy, slave-based plantations. So they wanted to bring it in. Van Buren, however, took a stance against the immediate annexation of Texas. That lost him support in the party, and he could not get the votes at the Democratic National Convention to be nominated. Instead, they turned to someone who had not been considered by most as a candidate, James K. Polk. He had been very firm that he was in support of bringing Texas in right away, and there wasn't anything particularly objectionable about him to anyone. So he was able to bring the party together. In the 19th century, sometimes they would refer to someone like that as an available man. So he got the nomination, and it was on to the campaign. Now, he did eventually win, and that meant, for that to happen, it meant that the party had to come together. The various leaders in different parts of the country had to campaign for him. And in Pennsylvania, that meant James Buchanan. He was in the Senate, one of the leading politicians, especially in the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania. So it was expected that he would campaign for the Polk ticket. There was one problem. When they nominated Polk for president, they had chosen George M. Dallas as his running mate. George M. Dallas, who's not as well known today because he didn't become president, but he was another prominent Pennsylvania politician, Pennsylvania Democrat, had also served as a senator, like Buchanan, had also been minister to Russia. They had kind of these oddly parallel political careers. But he belonged to a different faction of the Democratic Party within the state. So he and Buchanan were kind of political enemies, even within the party. So when he was nominated, Buchanan wasn't very happy. And for about a month, he kind of held off from making any comments about the Polk-Dallas ticket. Finally, though, he did. The convention was around the end of May, and just before July 4th, he issued a public letter saying that he supports the ticket, that he wants people to vote for Polk and Dallas, and he started crisscrossing the states, giving speeches in their favor. It became clear in a couple of his letters one of the reasons why he was now in support of Polk, and it didn't really have to do with James Polk. He wrote to Matilda Catron, who was the wife of a Supreme Court Justice, John Catron, explaining his views on the ticket. I'll quote from that. "Under the circumstances, I do not think a better nomination could have been made. And as I had the honor of being Mrs. Polk's candidate, I feel myself bound both in gallantry and gratitude to do my best for the election of her husband. When she becomes the lady of the White House, as I believe she will, I shall both expect and desire to be a favorite." So it may seem odd that he's talking more about Mrs. Polk, Sarah Polk, than about James Polk. It actually makes a lot of sense. James Polk was a very talented politician. He was good at running a plantation from afar, and he was, by all accounts, a talented lawyer. And that was about it. He didn't have many interests outside of his 3 jobs. He wasn't good at socializing. He was very uncomfortable among people. He was able to sort of have the social conversations that were necessary to being an effective politician, but he really had to struggle at it. Sarah was much better at this. She was talented at what some people call parlor politics, at having effective conversations around dinners and at parties to get people to vote for your candidate. She would read the newspapers for James and let him know what the atmosphere was in terms of campaign so that he'd know how to respond to it. She was a real asset in his political career, and she built a lot of the personal relationships, including with Buchanan, that James just was not good at. The 2 Jameses did, however, correspond. They did develop something of a relationship. And in one of his letters to James Polk, James Buchanan again brought up the importance of Sarah. He wrote, "Please to remember me in the kindest and most respectful terms to Mrs. Polk. Tell her that although I have nothing to ask from the president, I shall expect much from the president's lady." Soon, though, it turned out he did have something to ask of the president. Polk got elected in the fall, and as soon as he did, his first job, and he'd even begun thinking about this before the election, was to choose a cabinet. Lots of his correspondence thereafter had to do with it. He was getting opinions from Van Buren and other leading lights in the party about whom he should appoint. He considered many people for various cabinet posts and often changed his mind, with one exception. It was very clear from the beginning that he knew he wanted James Buchanan to be his Secretary of State. And there were probably a few reasons for that. One may have been that Buchanan had such a good relationship with Sarah. One was certainly that Buchanan had been effective in getting Pennsylvania to go for Polk. It had a lot of electoral votes, was a very important state. It hadn't been clear that it would necessarily vote Democratic, but Buchanan helped to make that happen, so he got rewarded. He was also known as just a very effective diplomat within the Democratic Party through his work in Russia and his work in the Senate. So Polk decided to appoint him Secretary of State. Here, incidentally, I believe this is the earliest photograph we have of a president sitting with his cabinet. Unfortunately, it's missing one person, and that person is Buchanan. Polk is in the front row sitting. He's the second one from the right. In the back, it's as if they've positioned themselves to show that someone is missing. I'm not sure why Buchanan wasn't there. He was probably busy with State Department business at the time. But this is the rest of the cabinet. Polk, Buchanan? No. Oh. Yeah. We do have pictures of James and Sarah. Fortunately, I'll show one with her later as well. Buchanan, he agreed to be in the cabinet, but there was one problem when Polk made the offer. That was that Polk had made a pledge. He would only serve one term as president. This wasn't too unusual a pledge. Other candidates had made it. His opponent had made it. But part of the reason he did was because a lot of Democrats wanted to be president, and James Buchanan was one of them. So he didn't want to stand in their way. He said, I'll only serve one term, so you can feel free to support me, because then you can run 4 years later. However, Polk said, in 4 years, when that new election is going on, I don't want to be involved. I'm not going to take sides among Democrats on who should be the candidate. And I don't want my cabinet to either. Don't take sides. And if you're in my cabinet, you should not be running for president. If you do run for president, then you should quit the cabinet. So Buchanan, who very much did want to run for president in 4 years, had a meeting with Polk. They got together at the hotel where they were staying before the inauguration, and decided how exactly they're going to word this so that both of them will be happy with the arrangement. And they did come up with something. Polk wrote a letter officially offering the job to Buchanan, and Buchanan wrote him back with his official response, accepting the position and agreeing with Polk, quote, we should have repose from the strife of making presidents. We do our jobs, not always think about who's going to be president next. But then he continued, I cannot proclaim to the world that in no contingency shall I be a candidate for the presidency in 1848. If unexpectedly to myself, the people should present me as their candidate, I cannot declare in advance that I would not accede to their wishes. But in that event, I would retire from the cabinet unless you should desire me to remain. So he has no interest in being president. But if people nominate him or try to nominate him, then he'll quit the cabinet unless Polk gives him an exception. So he gets the job, and in March, they take on their new roles. As far as how the cabinet was run, Polk, from the beginning, had been, he was the youngest man who'd ever been president at the time. He was only 49, and he'd been so unknown nationally before this that some people had thought he'd be kind of a figurehead, that his Secretary of State or another cabinet member, or even Van Buren from upstate New York, would be actually the power behind the throne. Polk made it clear that would not be the case. As he put it in the letter, I intend myself to be the president. And his cabinet meetings kind of reflected this. They would meet at least once every week, a little more often if something important was going on. And he'd keep quiet himself at first so that each cabinet member could give their opinion on whatever the issue was. Then Polk would make his decision, and his was the only vote that mattered. But he did invite their opinions. Occasionally, a cabinet member did take a more prominent role, Buchanan in particular as the Secretary of State. In 1847, for example, Polk went to North Carolina to attend the commencement at the University of North Carolina, his alma mater. And while he was gone, Buchanan kind of took over the government. The vice president wasn't even in Washington. When the Senate wasn't in session, he would preside over the Senate when it was. But when they were out of session, he usually went back to Philadelphia to be with his family and continued his private law practice. So Buchanan, as the senior member of the government, was in charge, and a newspaper actually referred to him as the president pro tem. More often, though, Polk and Buchanan were working together on diplomatic efforts. That was the purview of the Secretary of State. And these generally had to do with national expansion. Now, here's a map of the United States when they took office. The United States was really the triangle on the right here, the area shown in green and light red. A triangle bounded on the west by Texas in the south and the Rocky Mountains in the north. All the rest of that was other countries. Texas, as I said, was an independent nation. Everything to the west of it, extending to the Pacific, was part of Mexico. And the area from the northern border of California, farther north in the shows, down to the southern boundary of Alaska, was what was known as Oregon country. It was area that was claimed by the US and was claimed by Britain as part of Canada, but they hadn't agreed on who exactly controlled it and whether there was a particular boundary separating the American and British parts. So it was held under what they called joint occupation. People from either country were free to go there, but neither country could establish a government. And most of the people there were Native Americans, not white people from either place. Around this time, though, there was a movement that came to be known as Manifest Destiny. The idea that the United States should expand to more areas, that Americans should spread their ideals, their people, their economic system to all of Central North America or even beyond. The term Manifest Destiny was invented by a journalist named John L. O'Sullivan. Polk seems never to have used the term, but he very much agreed with the policy, as did Buchanan and most Democrats. So they started working together to try to make Manifest Destiny happen. And one area where they did this was in Cuba. Not one of the ones we usually think about first, but they wanted to acquire Cuba, or at least a lot of Democrats did. I just mentioned John L. O'Sullivan. He invented the term Manifest Destiny, and in early 1848, he showed up at the White House. He had a conversation with Polk in which he encouraged him to try to buy Cuba. It was very similar to the reason people wanted Texas. Cuba also was an area based with a slave-based plantation economy, and Americans, especially white Democrats in the South, wanted the US to have more plantation territory. In the case of Cuba, it was growing primarily sugar. So he encouraged Polk to buy this from Spain, which owned Cuba at the time. Polk, as was his tendency, did not give his opinion. He kept a straight face while O'Sullivan was making his pitch and let him go on his way. But a couple of months later, Polk brought this up with Buchanan and told him to, yes, go ahead, try to buy Cuba from Spain. So Buchanan passed on the word to Romulus M. Sanders, the US minister to Spain in Madrid, and Sanders began negotiations. They went on for a couple of months. He tried offering up to $100 million as Polk had authorized him, and that was a huge amount of money at the time. But Spain was not willing to sell. So this was, in a sense, a failure. As you've probably guessed, the US did not acquire Cuba. In other areas, they were more successful. First, let's look at Oregon. As I said, at the time, Oregon was under joint occupation between the US and British Canada. But in the 1840s, that was becoming more of a problem because more people had been traveling along what came to be known as the Oregon Trail. This is a road that stretched roughly from Missouri to the southern part of that purple area known as Oregon country. And as more and more white Americans were inhabiting this area, it became more important for the US government and for the British government to decide who controls it, who is able to set up a government for these people. Well, the US made a proposal. Polk and Buchanan, very early in their term, proposed to Britain that we set the boundary at the 49th parallel. Now, if you can see on that map at the far right, the little horizontal line in purple there, that's what is now the northern boundary of Montana. So that's the boundary between the US and Canada, which extended east from there. It's the 49th parallel of latitude. So they said, okay, just extend that west to the Pacific. Everything north will be part of Canada. Everything south will be part of the US. Britain immediately turned down the proposal. They did not offer a counterproposal. So Polk gathered his cabinet together to decide, how are we going to respond to this rejection? And Polk's inclination, and the inclination of most of the cabinet, was to go back to what had been an earlier position among many Democrats, what they called 54-40 or fight in the coming months, which oddly was usually spelled in the newspapers with a PH, 54-40, rather than an F, to get people's attention. The idea was 54-40, that line of latitude, is the southern boundary of Alaska. So they said, okay, Britain wouldn't take this compromise, so we say all of it should be American, that whole purple area, and we're not going to compromise. There was one exception in the cabinet, and that was James Buchanan. He had actually quite a heated argument with the president over this in the cabinet meeting, so heated that it inspired Polk to begin keeping a diary. It was a good thing in that case because that diary, which Polk kept for the rest of his term, is an excellent source for learning about what's going on in the administration. And in that very first entry, Polk described the argument he'd had with Buchanan. I'll quote from it. Mr. Buchanan intimated that if the president's views were carried out, calling for all this territory to be American, we would have war. To which the president replied, if we do have war, it will not be our fault. Mr. Buchanan expressed the opinion that the people of the US would not be willing to sustain a war for the country north of 49 degrees, and that if we were to have war, he would like to have it for some better cause. In particular, Buchanan went on, he was worried about having two wars at once, that the US would fight a war with Britain over this area and a war with Mexico over another land dispute that I'll get into a bit later. To continue with the diary, the president said that we should do our duty toward both Mexico and Great Britain and firmly maintain our rights and leave the rest to God and the country. Mr. Buchanan said he thought God would not have much to do in justifying us in a war for the area north of 49 degrees. So he made no bones about his disagreement. He was very blunt with Polk that he did not agree with this policy. He wanted to compromise. But again, Polk's vote was the only one that mattered. So that's what happened. For then, the US took on the position that they wanted all this land. That didn't end up happening. I won't go into the details, but over the next year, there were various proposals, counter-proposals, negotiations, and eventually in 1846, Britain made a proposal of its own. They proposed that they compromise and divide the territory at the 49th parallel. It was pretty much the same thing the US had proposed and they'd rejected a year earlier. The only major difference was that Vancouver Island, which does go slightly south of 49 degrees, that would entirely stay as part of Canada. So Polk gathered his cabinet together. What are we going to do? Are we going to accept this offer and submit it to the Senate as a treaty? And Polk at this point was happy to accept the offer. Most of the cabinet were too, but there was one exception, and that was James Buchanan. He said, no, we should push for 54-40. We need all this land. We shouldn't compromise with Britain. This was exactly the opposite of the position that he had taken a year earlier. And he, even when Polk told him, this is what we're going to do, we're taking the deal, he said, well, I, as Secretary of State, refused to write the letter to Britain accepting that. So Polk ended up writing it himself. After the cabinet dispersed, the Secretary of War, William L. Marcy, hung around, and he had a conversation with Polk about Buchanan's kind of odd response. And Polk recorded that in his diary. Mr. Marcy remarked to me that Mr. Buchanan's course was a very queer one, for that he had been for a long time the most strenuous advocate of settling the question on the basis of the 49 degree of north latitude. Polk went on a bit later, my impression is that Mr. Buchanan intends now to shun all responsibility for the submission of the British proposition to the Senate, so that if the 54-40 men shall complain, he may be able to say that my message submitting it did not receive his sanction. So Polk thought Buchanan, in his heart, he wants to compromise, but he's playing politics. In case he runs for office later, say for president, he wants to be able to get the votes of the people who wanted all that additional land. And this trend, this idea of Buchanan changing his mind and Polk getting miffed about it, continued over the course of the administration. The other major area had to do with Mexico and Texas. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Texas, when they entered office, was an independent country. It had been since 1836. Until 1836, Texas was part of Mexico. But around that time, a lot of Americans had emigrated into Mexico, specifically into Texas. Eventually, so many did that Mexico closed the border, but the Americans kept immigrating illegally into Texas. And in 1836, those American expatriates set up their own government. There was some dispute about whether it was a legitimate government, but they called it the Government of Texas, and they declared Texas an independent country. Mexico didn't accept that, but they fought a war with Mexico, and on the battlefield, they did win, kind of established Texas's independence, and they were governing the area, though Mexico never accepted that it was separate from the country. Almost immediately, these Americans turned Texans started calling for Texas to be annexed to the United States. And that idea got a lot of support in the US because Texas did have a plantation-based economy. The Americans who had moved there had set up these large plantations, often brought enslaved African Americans there to work them. And they thought it fit very well with the US. The problem was American politicians did not want to tick off Mexico. They figured that, well, if we take this land, then Mexico, instead of fighting a war with Texas, will now be fighting a war with the United States. And it got even more complicated because there wasn't agreement over where the boundary of Texas was. Like in the map on the left here, you see kind of the dark pink purple area that's labeled Texas. That is what Mexico considered Texas to be. But the larger area, including the farther western area in lighter purple, that was additional area that Texas, the American turned Texas government of Texas, claimed was part of Texas. Mexico said, no, that's part of other Mexican provinces, but they said, no, this is part of Texas. So if the US annexes Texas, which does it annex? Along which boundaries? If it takes the larger parts, then from Mexico's perspective, it's taking not only Texas, but more of Mexico. Well, Polk ran on a campaign to take Texas. So that's what he did. Even before he took office, his predecessor, John Tyler, recognized that Polk's election had effectively been a referendum on Texas, that the American people wanted to annex Texas. So Tyler started the process, got a bill through Congress, and then when Polk took office, he finished the process, the diplomatic process, and then passing a law to actually make Texas a state. So at the very end of December 1845, Texas became a state. As many had expected, it did lead to war. And I'm not going to go into the details of the Mexican-American War, but it went on from spring of 1846 until early in 1848. Ultimately, the US won. But I want to look at two moments in it, at the beginning and the end, as Polk discussed with his cabinet and with Buchanan, how to deal with this dispute with Mexico. Now, at the beginning, actually, around the time that fighting broke out it was in this disputed area of Texas in the Southwest, Polk brought his cabinet together to decide if they are going to declare war. And they all agreed that yes, Mexico, by coming into this area that the US now claims and firing on Americans, they have started a war, so we should fight it. And actually, even before they knew fighting had broken out, they all agreed that yes, we want to go to war. The idea was for the US to establish clear title over Texas, and to do even more. Polk wanted to not just take Texas, but take all the land west of it, everything from there extending to the Pacific. The idea being that the Mexican government owed a lot of money to American citizens. So he said, okay, well, they should give us all this land so then we can distribute it to those creditors. And that's how Mexico will pay off its debts. So this war will be not just to take one part of Mexico, but to take kind of all that northern area, which amounted to half of Mexico's territory. Well, there was one exception to agreement in that part, Buchanan. He didn't think that the U.S. should say that we want to take all that land. He proposed that he issue a statement saying the U.S. did not want to acquire any land beyond Texas. We are going to war to defend our borders, but nothing more than Texas. Polk said, no, that's not the idea. We're not saying that, and that was the end of it. 2 years later, the cabinet again got together. This was because now there was a treaty. In February of 48, U.S. and Mexican diplomats had signed a treaty ending the war, establishing peace, and setting the new boundary. Under this boundary, the U.S. got Texas with the larger boundaries and got all the land west of it to the Pacific. And most of the cabinet and Polk were content with this, that we can accept this treaty, send it to the Senate. There was one exception, that was James Buchanan. And Polk recorded in his diary what Buchanan had said. Mr. Buchanan repeated his objections to the treaty. He wanted more territory and would not be content with less than the line of the Sierra Madre. So he wanted to take a much larger part of Mexico, not just this part, not just half, but like 3/4 of the country. Many people, many Democrats in particular, actually were called the All Mexico movement. They wanted to take the whole country, just obliterate Mexico from the map and make it all U.S. territory. Buchanan didn't go that far, but he wanted to take most of it. Polk continued in his diary, I deemed it to be my duty to remind Mr. Buchanan of his total change of opinion and position on the subject. I cannot help laboring under the conviction that the true reason of Mr. Buchanan's present course is that he is now a candidate for the presidency, and he does not wish to incur the displeasure of those who are in favor of the conquest of all Mexico. So again, he thought Buchanan was playing politics, and Buchanan was in fact a candidate for the presidency. By that time, people, especially in Pennsylvania, but to some extent throughout the country, had been pushing him as the Democratic nominee. And he'd been writing some letters to newspapers that really came across as interest in being president, as campaign letters. Curiously enough, he did not resign from the cabinet. At one point around this time, he wrote a little letter to Polk in which he said, that letter I wrote to you after you offered me the job, I didn't keep a copy of it, so I don't really remember what I said. Could you send me a copy to remind me? Polk wrote in his diary, this seems to be the first time he ever remembered he wrote that letter. And he sent an aide off looking for a copy of it. It's not clear if he found one to show Buchanan. They were not on good terms at this point, and that got even worse soon thereafter. This treaty, before it became public, or before it was supposed to become public, it got leaked to a newspaper. And the Congress launched an investigation. It was never really concluded who had leaked it, but Polk and others strongly suspected it had been James Buchanan. The particular journalist who had published it in the newspaper had been seen walking in and out of both the State Department and Polk's house, in Buchanan's house. He was writing pieces that Buchanan interpreted as puff pieces to support Buchanan's nomination. So that put them in even worse terms. Polk at this point was ready to fire Buchanan. He wished that he could. He wrote, I have constantly for months felt the embarrassment the embarrassment which he gave me by remaining in the cabinet. He has been selfish, and all his acts and opinions seem to have been controlled with a view to his own advancement, so much so that I can have no confidence or reliance in any advice which he may give upon public questions. But Polk continued, he didn't feel that he could politically fire Buchanan at this point because there were such important diplomatic issues going on with the war and everything else, and he had a hostile majority in Congress. Whigs were in control of it, so he didn't think it was a good time to have to choose a new Secretary of State, so he didn't. That said, even though they had these problems, they had been quite successful in their mission of accomplishing manifest destiny. They hadn't gotten Cuba, but by the end of their term, This was the United States. It had pretty much the boundaries of the continental US today, except for just a little territory in the Southwest that the US got a few years later. The US had the boundaries with both Canada and Mexico that we're familiar with. At the same time, another legacy of their partnership had to do with the debate over slavery. With all this new land in the West, the debate over it escalated as people were trying to decide, should the United States permit slavery in that Western territory? Mexico had banned it, except in Texas and one other small part of Mexico. But would the US introduce it, or would they continue to ban it? That was very much a northern-southern dispute more than a Whig Democratic one. One other thing I should say, so as not to suggest that Polk and Buchanan, or the Polks and Buchanan, were always at odds, is that they did sometimes socialize. Polk was not big on socializing in general, but even he did it sometimes. This is the only picture I know of that includes both James Buchanan and James Polk. On the far left, you have Buchanan. Next to him is Harriet Lane, his niece, who would serve as White House hostess when he was president. On the third person from the right is Polk, and the woman next to him in the middle is Sarah Polk, his wife. The woman on the far right is Dolly Madison, actually, and she was the former First Lady and still kind of a sort of a mentor to other First Ladies, including to Sarah Polk. Before I close, one other kind of success that I want to discuss that they had, which is a particularly odd one, also had to do with Cuba. And this is surrounding a man named John Little, who was also a Pennsylvanian. He was from Philadelphia. And in 1834, John Little lived there with his wife and children. They were free Black Americans, and he was an employee of the American Colonization Society. This was an organization that had been set up in the 18-teens mostly by white people who thought that Black and white people could never live together in peace. So some of them supported ending slavery, some didn't, but they figured any free Black people in the United States have to be expelled from the country because they just can't stay here with white people. They can't get along. So they set up a colony in Africa, what became Liberia, and started running shiploads of free Black Americans there so they could start a new life free from government by white people. Many of the people who participated in this were racist. They thought this is because Black people can never be part of our country. John Little, as an African-American who worked for them, it's unclear what his motivations were, but he was on several ships carrying these either recently freed or always free Black people to Liberia. And he went in 1834 on his last such trip aboard a ship called the Jupiter. Well, they successfully left their people at Liberia. And as they were heading back to return to the United States, they shipwrecked right off the coast of Africa. They managed to get to shore and to get to a city there. So John started looking around for a ship that would take him back to the United States, but he wasn't able to find one. He did, however, find other ships that were going to the Caribbean. The area where he was, it was a major slave trading port. So there were lots of these ships carrying Africans who had been captured and put into lives of slavery to Cuba and other parts of the Caribbean and South America, where slavery was the central economy. So bringing these people to lives of bondage. And in what must have been a very uncomfortable arrangement, he agreed to work in Africa for one of these slave traders in exchange for passage aboard a slave ship to Cuba so that he could eventually make his way home to Philadelphia. He got papers from this trader in Africa saying that he was a free American citizen so that he wouldn't be confused with the enslaved people aboard the ship. Made his way to Matanzas, Cuba, but was confused with the enslaved people aboard the ship. Things did not go well. Whatever papers he had, the people running the ship just sent him along with the others into what they call the barracoons. This is a picture of one. It's where they would send these people to be displayed as products to be sold, and where planters around Cuba would come and buy them for their labor. He was, in fact, sold to a sugar planter in Cuba. He showed that planter his papers, showed, see here, I'm a US citizen, I am a free man. And so that planter went to the trader in Cuba who had sold him and said, look, you're not supposed to sell him to me. He's an American, he's a free man. The trader said, how about this? We'll reduce his price and forget about his freedom. And they both agreed on that. So he goes back to the sugar plantation. Somehow, I'm not sure how, Little did manage to get word to the US consul at Matanzas, Cuba, who sent word back to the State Department in the US. And the US government contacted the Cuban government, the Spanish government of Cuba, and told them, you have this free American who's enslaved on a plantation, send him back. And they said, okay, we'll send him back as long as you pay for him. And that was the end of that. The US government abandoned the effort. 11 years later, remember John L. O'Sullivan? He was the guy who invented Manifest Destiny, the term, went to the White House encouraging Polk to buy Cuba. Well, around this time, as part of that effort, he went to Cuba. His daughter and son-in-law actually lived there, and he was investigating the island as part of an effort to get the US to buy it, to report back to the Polk administration of what things are like there, what kind of technology they have in their plantations, so you know what you're getting if you buy it. Well, as he was touring one of these plantations, suddenly one of the enslaved Black people there starts talking to him in English, and that is John Little. He tells him a story. O'Sullivan promises to spread the word back in the US. He goes to Washington and meets with Buchanan, tells Buchanan about this story, and Buchanan says, okay, we're going to get him back. We're going to free this US citizen from his life in slavery. He orders the US consul in Havana, a man named John Campbell, to demand that John Little be freed. Campbell contacts the Governor General of Cuba under the Spanish government, and he's very forceful in his demand. He actually goes beyond his orders. He threatens that the US will blockade the island of Cuba if they don't free this guy. Buchanan then kind of scolds him for that because he didn't have the authority. And as Buchanan pointed out, you were effectively threatening war against Cuba and Spain, which we are not willing to do. But still, the Governor General agreed. He said that, yes, we will free this man, John Little. And the Cuban government actually forces both the plantation owner and the trader who sold him to the plantation owner to pay Little 11 years worth of wages plus interests, and to pay the cost of his trip back home. So John Campbell, the consul, has his son, Lucius Campbell, accompany John Little back to the United States. He brings him first to Washington and brings him to the State Department, where presumably he introduced him to Buchanan, though I don't have evidence specifically of that. Lucius Campbell also went to the White House to tell Polk what he'd done, and it's unclear whether John Little accompanied him. I like to think that he did, but I haven't found any reference to it. Polk, alas, in his diary, he doesn't mention every meeting he had, so he doesn't mention that one with Campbell and possibly Little. Then finally, John Little goes back to Philadelphia, and he gets a very enthusiastic welcome from the local anti-slavery organization. Sadly, though, he's never able to find his family again. That said, this is for Buchanan and Polk and Campbell, this is kind of a curious success they had, a curious effort. All of them were very much in support of slavery. I mean, Buchanan was from Pennsylvania, but Polk from Tennessee and Campbell from South Carolina. They were pro-slavery. Polk was a major slave owner. They had no problem with supporting the enslavement of people they considered to be legally slaves. But when this Black man was enslaved, but on paper it said he was a US citizen, they went to these great efforts to give him the rights and freedom that he deserved. So it said something about the interesting distinctions they made in race and law. Now, that is the end of my talk. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have, whether you're in the room or online.
And I have a microphone that I can bring to you.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the 1840 Democratic Convention, John Tyler's involvement, and what round James Polk got nominated on?
Okay, the 1844 election. Yeah. Yeah, in that one, and I don't remember the number of rounds, but at the beginning, it was clear that in the Democratic Convention that Van Buren had the most votes, and he got a clear majority from the beginning. But as they had in every convention before that, the Democrats passed a rule that they had to get a 2/3 majority in order to choose a nominee. It was largely Buchanan's opponents largely Van Buren's opponents who supported that measure because they knew Van Buren couldn't get 2/3 of the votes. So they passed that, then they went through many ballots in which he would get some. I think Lewis Cass would get some. Polk got a very few early on. Buchanan would get some. They were really distributed among a lot of people outside of Van Buren. Then finally, it was clear he was not going to get any. So Polk had a few lieutenants. Polk himself wasn't at the convention, but he had some lieutenants there, George Bancroft, Cave Johnson, kind of all of them under the sort of the distant supervision of Andrew Jackson back in Nashville. And they worked the hallways to get people to support Polk. So I don't remember the number, but it took quite a few ballots, but once they kind of gave up on Van Buren, it went very quickly to Polk. As far as John Tyler, he was the incumbent president. He'd been elected as a Whig, but had been expelled from the Whig Party. He tried to run as a third-party candidate under what they called the Tyler Party. But around the time Polk was nominated, he actually kind of liked Polk. They had a lot of similar views, and especially similar views toward Texas. So once it was clear that Polk would get the Democratic nomination, he pulled out of the election. He was happy to let Polk win.
If my memory serves me correctly, Polk did not live very long after he was no longer president. And if that's so, did he have any health issues when he was president?
But when he was president and throughout much of his life, he did have a lot of health issues. Most of them were gastrointestinal issues, which Washington's water system did not help with. There was very little distinction between the sewer and the water sources. So politicians had a lot of health problems in their families. Polk himself he'd had surgery when he was in his teenage years to remove some kidney stones. Whiskey was the only thing to dull the pain. And because of that, many people believe that's why he was never able to have children. He and his wife did not have children. As far as his death, there was a more specific cause. You're right, he didn't live long after his presidency, just 3 months, the shortest post-presidency in U.S. history. He took a long, circuitous route back home, went through the South, kind of celebratory journey, having meetings, and still all of these celebrations, both on his ships and on the trains and in the cities he went to. And along the way, he caught cholera. There was a global cholera pandemic at the time that had just recently entered the U.S. He caught it. It was at times people on the ship were getting it, people in the cities were getting it. He didn't know if it was safer to leave the boat or not. But finally, he came down with it and spent the last little bit of his life back at home, suffering from cholera, and died very quickly.
Yeah. You touched a bit in the beginning on the geographical and cultural backgrounds of both Buchanan and Polk. And I know that, I'm fairly certain that Polk was of Scots-Irish Presbyterian extraction rather than the Tidewater English. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
Yeah, and I know that Buchanan was as well. And I'm just wondering, Buchanan's kind of an anomaly for a Northern Democrat, because even by this time, the party was splitting between the Northern, who were at least not radical or extreme, I should say, for slavery. They were more moderate or against it. And in the South, of course, they were becoming more pro-slavery and wanting to defend it. So I'm just wondering, with Buchanan, in the case of Buchanan, do you think that his attitudes towards slavery may have harkened back somewhat to his ethno-religious background, you know, the Calvinist type of theology that the Scots-Irish Presbyterians held. And of course, they populated the South, and they were among the strongest pro-slavery leaders in the South, politicians. So I'm just wondering if you think that, you know, what made Buchanan such a pro-slavery? You know, he was a Northerner, but I'm thinking, but he was also a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian. So did that have something to do with it?
As far as Buchanan specifically, there are probably people here who could answer that much better than I can in Lancaster and Wheatland. I'm not an expert on Buchanan's religious views. On the more general question of the use of religion in justifying or opposing slavery, it is remarkable what divergent conclusions people came to in print from their use of the same religious basis. And often people would have these arguments in print about saying that the Bible and our religion clearly support slavery, and the Bible and our religion clearly oppose slavery, and then they'd sometimes publish them sort of going back and forth in the same periodicals, making arguments such as, like, in the Bible, people have slaves, therefore the Bible supports slavery, and others saying, well, they did have slaves, but in the New Testament, we don't see the defense of slavery we see in the Old Testament, so we see an advancement in where humanity should go, so now we're beyond where it's okay to have slavery. Polk himself, and yeah, he was very much in support of slavery. He was not a man taken to philosophical discussions, so we don't have sort of anything that he's written where he said, here's why I believe slavery is right, or here's why I think abolitionists are wrong. He considered, as far as religion, he associated himself more with the Methodists than Presbyterians, even though he'd been raised as a Presbyterian. He was baptized on his deathbed as a Methodist. Yeah, Buchanan and Presbyterians, the people called Scots-Irish, I can't speak much to that.
He was born very close to the line with Maryland. Perhaps he might have felt akin with, you know, similar types of ethno-religious communities southwest.
I actually think that Buchanan was more in line with his thinking about the culture of the South more than he was with the Northern. Yeah. Any other questions?
Two very quick questions. First, going back to that picture of his cabinet, Polk's cabinet. One of the people on there, is that George Bancroft? Is that the one who goes on to be the well-known historian, George Bancroft? Then the next one, up top on the right, is that William Walker? Or is that his, what was his?
The one on the top right, that is Bancroft, actually.
Top right, that's Bancroft.
Yes.
William Walker, though. Or was that
I
Robert
think of
Walker?
Robert J. Walker. Robert J. Walker was his Secretary of the Treasury.
Am I thinking of the same
He
Walker?
is the tall one in the middle.
Oh, okay. Am I thinking of the same Walker that's sort of a kind of a provocateur? It goes down to. That's another one. That's William Walker. All right.
Yes, and yeah, Bancroft, that is the same George Bancroft who became a prominent historian. He was writing his histories at this time. And actually, he served two positions under Polk. First, he was Secretary of the Navy. And then he had a job he really wanted. He was Minister to the United Kingdom. And one reason he wanted that job was so that he could work in the British archives researching his histories. And I have some attachment to him because I actually went to Bancroft School. My high school was named after him in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he was from.
I think you might have punctured a misunderstanding on my part. I just want to be clear about it. I always thought that both Polk and Buchanan wanted the border between the U.S. and Mexico at the end of the Mexican War quite close to Mexico City. And that the U.S. envoy to negotiate the treaty abandoned that and said, we'll make the border the Rio Grande, which the Mexicans would accept. If I understood, you said that Polk did not subscribe to that. Did I?
Yes, that's correct. Though you also make an important point. Yeah, the envoy Nicholas P. Trist, who'd been chief clerk of the State Department, he was the one in Mexico negotiating. They had considered sending Buchanan himself, but if the Mexicans weren't willing to negotiate, they figured it would look too bad if the Secretary of State were turned away. So they sent Trist. And yes, he after he'd been negotiating for a while without any success, Polk recalled him, said, "You're not succeeding, so come back." But Trist thought, "Oh no, I can still succeed. So I'm going to ignore that recall and continue working." And he did, and he got the treaty signed, and Polk accepted it. Though Polk refused to pay his wages after the time when he'd been officially recalled. Buchanan said, "Well, you should pay them at least until the earliest time when he could have returned home." Polk said, "No, we're not even going to do that." As far as whether Polk wanted to have the border all the way near Mexico City, Polk was kind of more moderate on that. And he was open to different views, but he thought both those who wanted to take all or nearly all of Mexico and those who didn't want to take any land were extremists. So he was more in the middle. The line that he got was pretty much what he wanted.
One final question. This has been killing me. Who is Cave Johnson, and was that a common first name for that area?
Cave Cave Johnson.
He's the one that's tallest guy.
That's Cave. Okay.
Yeah.
I was mixing them with the one standing. That's Cave.
Cave Johnson
Okay.
is the tall guy, and he was the president's postmaster general.
Yes. Yeah, and okay, yeah, I was mixing up who's who. And yeah, a longtime friend of Polk, supporter of his back in Tennessee. No, I have never encountered another Cave. A colleague of mine, Tom Chafin, whom I worked with on the Polk project, he would joke the Cave is actually a nickname. His name is Cavern. But no, he is, it was Cave, and he's the only Cave I've encountered. I don't know why he was named that. I mean, now I study Millard Fillmore, talk about other uncommon names, but Millard at least was his mother's maiden name.
Thank you for all your details. I don't know how you keep all those details straight. I'd like to know, why did you choose to do all the doing all of his journals, and why you focused on him? Why did you choose Polk? And I'd like to know, what's your next project?
Well, first of all, I should share some credit. And as Mr. Clark said, I worked on the James K. Polk project. We published 14 volumes of his letters. I didn't publish 14 volumes. I came in near the end of that. The project went on for 61 years, which is longer than Polk lived. And I was there for the last 10 years of it. So I was the fourth lead editor, and there were, I think, 43 people over the course of the project who worked on it. Yeah, I worked on the last 3 volumes of it. Polk, because he was so instrumental in the period, especially in expanding the United States, I think that's what led the project to be begun at the beginning. This was at a time in the 1950s when a lot of these projects were being started, what we call documentary editions, to publish original primary sources so people can learn from those documents. Yeah, so by the time, I mean, I had always been interested in this period, the period of expansion, especially the increasing debate over slavery. Polk had been, not so much as an individual, but for his activities, had been of interest to me since I was in high school. So I was happy to join that project when a job came up. Before that, I had been at the papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, American women suffragists. So I'd been doing a little of this type of work before that. As I was working on Polk, people would sometimes ask me what I'm going to do after Polk, and I would joke Taylor, because he was the next president. And eventually I took my own joke seriously. So now I'm working on, as Mr. Clark said, the correspondence of Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore, publishing their letters before and during their presidencies. Taylor died while he was in office. Fillmore, as vice president, took over, so it made sense to combine those.
We'll have time for 2 more questions. No?
We have many criteria by which we rank presidents today, but as a scholar of Polk, where would you rank him?
I do not rank presidents. Presidents, living in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, and many periods within those, they dealt with such different questions and had such different responsibilities, though they held the same office, that I think it was kind of a fool's errand to try to rank them, to say the second president was like twice as good as the 23rd president, and just completely different situations. So I would not rank him. Sorry, remind me then, are we talking about Buchanan or Polk? Polk. He was a very effective president. He got done a lot of what he wanted to do. There's a story that some of you may have heard that Polk had 4 things he wanted to accomplish as president, and then he accomplished them. That story is almost certainly a fabrication. It was told, Tom Chafin, whom I mentioned from the Polk Project, he wrote a little book about this called Met His Every Goal, ? Because that story was first told in the 1880s by George Bancroft, the great historian whose memory may have been fading, or he may have wanted to make his old boss look good. He seems never to have mentioned it before then, but suddenly he started saying that on Inauguration Day, Polk said, "Here are the 4 things I want to do as president." So Polk probably never said that, but he did accomplish a lot. I mean, as you can see with the map earlier, as well as other things, extending the first humanitarian mission using naval ships to Ireland and Scotland during the potato famine. And he did accomplish a lot as president. People can debate whether it was good or bad as far as the decisions.